What exactly is ASEAN? When we talk about ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you might picture a bunch of nations in Southeast Asia coming together to talk about trade, talk about diplomacy, settle disputes, and even pose for those, awkward group photos at the end of every summit. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen those photos I'm talking about. But the story of ASEAN, the story of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia, goes way deeper than these awkward group photos. It goes way deeper than ASEAN itself. And honestly, it's a lot more messier and a lot more fascinating than what most textbooks or even viral videos would actually tell you. I mean, think about this. What could a 1,000-year-old copper plate buried near Manila possibly tell us about ASEAN today? Why did promising regional alliances like Maphilindo or SEATO broke apart so fast? And let's be honest, can ASEAN actually survive huge crises like the civil war in Myanmar, the deadly clashes along the Thai-Cambodian border, or even the web of conflict in the South China Sea? You see, ASEAN was not born in isolation. It grew out of ancient trade routes, colonial chaos, and complicated political tensions that still lingers today. So to truly understand ASEAN's future, to truly understand how ASEAN works, or whether or not it actually works, we need to go back, way back to unpack ASEAN's complicated past, ASEAN's interwoven roots. So let's dig deeper. Mabuhay or Timapangan, luwid kayo. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. So this week marks 58 years since ASEAN was founded on August 8, 1967. And actually, fun fact, August 8 is also my mom's birthday, so special shout out and happy birthday to my beautiful mom. But back to our topic, ever since I was a little kid, I've always been fascinated by ASEAN. I've always been fascinated by Southeast Asian history. So in today's video, we'll dig deeper and explore a side of ASEAN's history that you probably rarely hear about. So first we'll rewind to ancient Southeast Asia, when diplomacy was not about boardrooms or treaties, was not about summits, but about ships sailing between islands and kingdoms, making deals through trade and even intermarriages. Then we'll fast forward to see how European colonialism and later Cold War politics created a fragmented region, setting the stage for ASEAN's birth in the 60s. And at the end, we'll also break down what makes ASEAN quite unique, its core principles and strength, and yeah, even ASEAN's weaknesses, by looking closely at how ASEAN handled or has not handled today's toughest regional crisis. So why does it even matter? Well, because Southeast Asia is not just some, small corner in the world. ASEAN is not just some small region in the world. It is actually home to over 700 million people. And if you think about it, that is nearly 1 in every 12 people in the entire planet. So whatever happens in Southeast Asia echoes globally, not just today, but throughout history. And if ASEAN is going to survive the next 58 years, then we need to remember that legacy, and we need to be honest about what needs to be changed. Now you might think that Southeast Asia has always been a patchwork of diverse and divided nations, divided countries. But the truth is, long before ASEAN, our ancestors have always been building connections across islands, across kingdoms and oceans. And understanding this matters because it shows us that ASEAN is not just some random modern invention, but actually part of a deeper history and a shared legacy. Something that is uniquely Southeast Asian. So picture this region 1,000 years ago, not just isolated islands or nations, but very busy and thriving maritime highways. Traders and sailors link places we now call the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Brunei, East Timor, Singapore, and many more. It was like a giant web of, trade and cultural exchange that connected these lands and islands with China, India, Arabia, and beyond, making Southeast Asia one of the most fascinating and one of the most important trade hubs throughout human history. And it wasn't all about swapping spices or silk. It wasn't all about swapping gold with jade or weapons with rice. It was diplomacy in action. Local rulers strengthened their power by distributing treasures and foreign goods. They did this by trading and intermarriages. And in fact, indigenous scripts recorded these transactions, proving that our ancestors managed complex societies, complex economies, and politics long before Europeans even arrived. And one of the best examples is the Laguna Copperplate Inscription, discovered near Manila in the 80s, but dated to the year 900. And this copperplate is fascinating, not just because it forgave someone's debt, but because the LCI used a blend of Sanskrit, Old Malay, Old Javanese, Old Kapampangan, and Old Tagalog. So think of it as a window into Southeast Asia's sophisticated, multilingual, and multicultural world, where diplomacy and trade and societies were already deeply complex over 1,000 years ago. And actually, the Laguna Copperplate is not the only one. There are so many ancient inscriptions like this, scattered all across Southeast Asia. These networks followed what is called the mandala system. So instead of fixed borders and rigid nation-states like in Europe, power in Southeast Asia was fluid, expanding outwards like ripples from strong centers. Centers such as Srivijaya, Majapahit, Ayutthaya, Manila, the Sultanates of Malacca, Brunei, Sulu, and so many others. Throughout history, Southeast Asian rulers built alliances through tribute, loyalty, and familial bonds, rather than strict territorial control. So if you think about it, it's a lot like friendships and families today, based on personal connections, trust, and mutual benefit, not rigid rules or fixed boundaries. ASEAN didn't just pop out of nowhere. It builds on centuries of regional cooperation and deeper connections. So when people say that Southeast Asians have always been connected, they're not really exaggerating. And if you think about it, we're literally walking in the footsteps of ancient traders and diplomats. But then again, if our ancestors were deeply connected, then why does Southeast Asia today feels a lot divided? Why does ASEAN's geopolitics today feel so tensed, like walking on eggshells? Well, it all comes down to one thing. It all comes down to one disruption: colonialism. And this chapter of history matters deeply because it explains why ASEAN even became necessary. When European empires showed up, they didn't see a fluid, interconnected region. They saw resources to exploit and territories to carve up. The Spaniards, the Dutch, the British, the Portuguese, and the French all imposed rigid borders, creating distinct colonies and territories where none existed before. So imagine Southeast Asia's vibrant, overlapping mandala networks as a beautiful piece of interwoven fabric. Now, colonialism ripped that fabric apart, but then stitched it back together into separate patches. And each colonial power established centralized rule, drawing lines that sliced through existing trade routes and cultural ties, thus dividing communities that were once united. Now, this changed identities and loyalties, pushing people to see themselves as distinct nations, separate from their neighbors that they had once considered part of a larger family, a larger community. This shift set the stage for tension. Countries became more defined by nationality and ethnicity in ways that they had never been before. So instead of overlapping alliances and fluid relationships, fluid connections, we ended up getting rigid national identities that laid the groundwork for future conflicts. Think of it like neighbors and families who used to freely share their gardens together, who used to share the bounties of their harvest together, but were suddenly forced to build fences, suddenly forgetting that they once relied on each other. So when those fences went up, misunderstandings and conflicts were unavoidable. And that is exactly what happened across Southeast Asia. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that pre-colonial Southeast Asia was perfectly peaceful. It wasn't. Conflicts and war still existed. But colonialism primed the region for heightened post-colonial tensions that still lingers today. For example, borders that were drawn by the colonizers became flashpoints later on, fueling territorial disputes, mistrust, and conflict between nations, just like what is currently going on between Thailand and Cambodia. And even when the colonizers eventually left, the divisions they created remained deeply ingrained. Now, this backdrop explains why earlier attempts at regional unity struggled. When the Europeans departed, Southeast Asia was no longer one cohesive family, but instead, it was neighbors divided by colonial fences. And ASEAN was later created to try and rebuild what had been torn apart, to reconnect a region fractured by centuries of outside control. Now, maybe you're thinking, if Southeast Asia had such deep connections, then why did it take so long to build something like ASEAN? And that is exactly the point, because understanding why earlier attempts failed actually tells us and reveals what made ASEAN finally succeed. Right after World War II, Southeast Asia got caught up in Cold War politics and tensions. The United States stepped in with SEATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, in 1954. SEATO was supposed to stop communism, but here's why it didn't work. SEATO was not really owned by the region. Think of it like a stranger trying to fix your family's argument without knowing the real issue, the real problems. So it just made people feel misunderstood and controlled by outsiders. Southeast Asian leaders knew that they needed their own regional group, one without foreign interference or foreign powers pulling the strings. So in 1961, Malaya, Thailand, and the Philippines formed the Association of Southeast Asia, or ASA. But ASA also fell apart, and one big reason was because the Philippines and Malaya couldn't agree over who owned Sabah or North Borneo. I mean, imagine trying to build a friendship while arguing over your backyard fence. You can't really cooperate well if you're busy fighting each other. And then came Maphilindo in 1963, an attempt at unity based on shared identities, shared culture, and heritage among Malaya, the Philippines, and Indonesia. It sounded great in theory, but it collapsed almost immediately. And the reason was that the three nation-states clashed over their core principles. Within mere months of Maphilindo's creation, Indonesia and the Philippines cut off diplomatic ties when the new Malaysian Federation was created. Indonesian President Sukarno rejected Malaysia's formation, sparking a confrontation that completely shut down cooperation. Sukarno viewed Malaysia's creation as a neo-colonial plot orchestrated by Britain, a foreign interference disguised as self-determination. Meanwhile, when Malaysia formally incorporated Sabah, without peacefully resolving the dispute, as agreed upon between the three nations, the Philippines rightfully felt betrayed, further escalating diplomatic tensions. Now, I've actually made other videos on the history of Maphilindo, and even an entire series on the history of the Sabah dispute, from pre-colonial to modern day. So if you want to dive deeper, make sure to watch them after this one. These early failures taught Southeast Asians very important lessons, that unity built only on outside threats or shared identities were not enough. What really mattered was building trust and making sure that the region was shaping its own destiny, its own future, on our own terms. And if you think about it, it's like planting seeds on shallow soils. They sprouted briefly but couldn't take root. Southeast Asia needed deeper foundations, free from outside control and internal suspicions. And that is exactly what ASEAN eventually provided. So by the mid-1960s, Southeast Asia had learned the tough lessons from previous attempts like Maphilindo and SEATO. Southeast Asia needed unity, but this time it was built differently. And here's how ASEAN did it. The real turning point came in 1966, when Indonesia officially ended the conflict against Malaysia. I mean, imagine neighbors finally deciding to stop fighting and start talking again. And that is exactly what happened. With tensions cooling down, the region was finally ready for a fresh start. So on August 8, 1967, the five countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand all signed the ASEAN Declaration in Bangkok, aka the Bangkok Declaration. So you had leaders like Adam Malik of Indonesia, Narciso Ramos of the Philippines, Tun Abdul Razak of Malaysia, Sinnathamby Rajaratnam of Singapore, and Thanat Koman of Thailand, all coming together and all determined not to repeat the past mistakes. And what made ASEAN different this time was that it was not built around military alliances like SEATO or narrow ethnic interests like Maphilindo, but instead it focused on economic growth, cultural development, and genuine regional stability. And fun fact for my Filipino viewers, Narciso Ramos, who signed the declaration in Bangkok, was actually the father of our former president, Fidel Valdez Ramos. It was like finally deciding to build a new community center, a neighborhood center, instead of more fences, instead of building security fences that are only dividing each other against one another. Finally, a new community center that is bringing people together through shared interest, mutual respect, and peaceful coexistence, uniting people through harmony instead of divisions. From its very foundation, ASEAN adopted core principles that really set it apart from other organizations: mutual respect for sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, and peaceful conflict resolution. Now, this meant that the countries agreed not to meddle in each other's business. So think of it like, neighbors promising not to barge into each other's homes, promising to respect each other's privacy and space. And they also committed to settle arguments calmly instead of violently fighting over fences. So what ASEAN created was intentionally different from earlier groups like SEATO or Maphilindo. It was secular, not tied to any single religion or ethnicity. And perhaps more uniquely, ASEAN relied on consensus. So every country's voice mattered equally. And this approach was deliberate. ASEAN wanted Southeast Asia to control its own destiny, without foreign powers or internal internal conflicts tearing it apart. So ASEAN showed us that genuine regional unity is possible when cooperation is built on respect, mutual trust, and common goals. Not fear, force, or rivalries. So understanding this can help us appreciate why ASEAN remains relevant, even with all of its imperfections. So now you see and hopefully understand ASEAN's hopeful and bright beginnings, optimistic beginnings. But let me ask you this. The real question, is ASEAN still effective today? Now, to answer this question, let us take a look at the recent crisis that really tested and really shook ASEAN's core values, ASEAN's own very foundations. So first up is the Myanmar Civil War, a civil war that started after a military coup d'etat in 2021. You'd think that ASEAN, with its commitment to regional peace, would jump in immediately to stop the violence, right? But it actually couldn't, because ASEAN's own rules prevented it from stepping in. ASEAN's foundational principle of non-interference means that member countries cannot intervene in each other's internal matters, in each other's internal conflicts. So imagine your neighbors arguing badly next door, but then you've agreed never to interfere, no matter how loud or violent the fighting gets. And that is exactly how ASEAN ended up stuck, unable to respond effectively to Myanmar's crisis, leaving the region divided over how to handle it. And then just this past few weeks, in July of 2025, a decades-old border dispute erupted into an armed conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. Now over 30 people were killed and around 300,000 were displaced in what is considered to be one of the most severe conflicts in recent Southeast Asian history. And again, ASEAN faced criticism for its inability to prevent or resolve this crisis quickly. Emergency talks only happened after mounting international pressure that forced both Cambodia and Thailand to the table. So think of it like neighbors arguing fiercely and violently until more voices, both from within and outside the neighborhood, pushed them to finally talk it out. Just think about it. Moments like this makes you really wonder, can the rules written almost 60 years ago, can it really handle and solve the conflicts of today? And it is not just about these conflicts. ASEAN also struggles with tensions in the South China Sea. Disagreements over maritime claims have made it difficult for ASEAN to form a united response. And again, highlighting how consensus-based decision-making can actually lead to paralysis, even when facing urgent security challenges. The core issue is how ASEAN makes decisions. Everything has to be by consensus. Everyone needs to agree. But in practice, consensus decision-making often leads to gridlock. Think about it. One member state alone, one member state disagreeing with the rest, can actually block the entire process, meaning that ASEAN's solutions to the problems tend to be the lowest common denominator, something that is safe, cautious, but sometimes ineffective. Let's face it, the struggles of ASEAN shows us that the principles created decades ago, while very well-intentioned, might actually not always fit today's realities. Conflicts like this force us to question whether or not the rules that once made ASEAN successful might actually be holding it back today. So looking back at its journey, you might be wondering, what does all of this history mean? What does all of this history teach us about ASEAN's future? The truth is, our past, our history, holds so much important clues about how ASEAN might stay relevant, about how ASEAN might actually thrive moving forward. Remember that ancient mandala system that we talked about earlier? It worked because it was flexible and based on genuine relationships. Rulers negotiated, adapted, and formed alliances fluidly. So think of it like, dancing. The mandala was about knowing how and when to move gracefully together, adapting to the changing rhythms instead of forcing everyone into the same rigid number of steps. And in case you haven't noticed, culturally, Southeast Asia once flourished by embracing diversity. Trade, art, spirituality, diplomacy, society. All of these connected us, creating shared identities, but without erasing differences. If you think about it, Southeast Asia was united not despite of diversity, but actually because of it. Through the centuries, cultural exchanges were like bridges, linking different islands, languages, and traditions, strengthening the whole region. Now fast forward to ASEAN today. I mean, the world has changed dramatically. It is now more digital, more connected, yet more divided, and even more unpredictable than ever. Now, the big question is, can ASEAN's original principles, like consensus-based decision-making and non-interference, still actually function effectively? Or do these structures need an update to stay relevant? Like a massive upgrade on your operating systems. And here is why reflecting on history is actually empowering. It is not all about nostalgia for the glitz and the glamour of the past. It is about clarity and reclaiming the wisdom passed down through generations, passed down through the centuries of genuine regional connection. Because again, ASEAN was born from centuries of experience. ASEAN's founders knew that regional unity couldn't be forced. Genuine unity had to grow from trust, respect, and flexibility. But those same leaders who signed the Bangkok Declaration 58 years ago on August 8, 1967, understood that structures will always need to evolve to meet the new challenges. So here's the bottom line. Maybe the real lesson here is that for ASEAN to truly succeed in the next 58 years, we need to revisit our ancient roots. We need to adapt those qualities to our modern day challenges, our modern day realities. Because again, ASEAN didn't just appear out of nowhere. ASEAN didn't just appear overnight. ASEAN emerged from ancient trade networks disrupted by colonialism and the Cold War, then later shaped by today's modern day conflicts. So if we really want for ASEAN to succeed and thrive for the next 58 years and beyond, we've got to remember why it started in the first place. Genuine cooperation, flexibility, and mutual respect amongst neighbors. Regional harmony based on justice and peace. And we've got to be honest about what really works and what really doesn't. ASEAN's future depends on our ability to adapt, just like how our ancestors did, how they adapted and survived through the centuries. Because to truly build a genuinely brighter future that truly works for everyone in Southeast Asia, we need to learn from our past. We've got to listen to the wisdom of our ancestors. We need to embrace change, but remain connected despite our differences. Now, through the decades, ASEAN leaders always talk about building prosperity and harmony throughout the region. But the truth is, to truly achieve that, we must first stand in solidarity, genuinely stand in solidarity, and build genuine peace and justice in our communities. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the future of ASEAN? What needs to change and what doesn't need to change? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to dive deeper into how Southeast Asia's past shape our world today, from ancient trade routes to modern alliances like ASEAN, make sure to watch my other videos on Southeast Asia's history, culture, and everything in between. Or grab copies of any of my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch in the links below. Maraming salamat po o hindi dakal pong salamat kay Hongan and Imbasa Melayo Terima Kasih. See you next time on Tagalog Kitakit sa Kapampangan, Mikitix and Imbasa Indonesia. Sampai nanti.